There is a moment in history, a single Friday afternoon, that cut the entire human story in two. Every event that had ever happened before it pointed toward it. Every event that came after it was shaped by it. And you already know it happened. What you may not know is exactly what it cost, what it felt like, what it truly meant, and what the historical record, beyond the pages of any Bible, actually says about the man who went to that cross and the empire that sent him there. In the year 30 A.D., Dama, give or take a single calendar rotation that historians still debate to this day, a man was executed in a backwater province of the Roman Empire. The Romans were extraordinarily efficient when it came to killing people. They had turned execution into a science, a system, an industry. They crucified thousands of men. In fact, after the slave revolt led by Spartacus in 71 BC, Rome lined the Appian Way, the most famous road in the world, with 6,000 crucified bodies stretching from Capua all the way to Rome. 6,000. And not one of those men is remembered by name. Not one of them changed anything. This one man was different. The Romans barely wrote his name down. He was a carpenter's son from a village so small it didn't appear on most Roman maps. He had no army. He wrote nothing. He held no political office. He owned nothing of material value. By every measure the ancient world used to judge significance, military power, political authority, wealth, conquest, Jesus of Nazareth had none of it. And yet, more than 2,000 years after those Roman soldiers drove iron nails through his wrists on a hill outside Jerusalem, and every clock on earth still counts time from the moment of his birth. Every courtroom in the Western world once required oaths sworn in his name. And today, more than 2.4 billion people, nearly a third of the entire human population of this planet, believe that what happened to him on that cross changed the eternal destiny of every human soul who has ever lived. 2,000 years. That is not a small thing. That is not an accident of history. Nations rise and fall. Empires that once controlled the world are now buried under the sand. The Roman Empire that crucified Jesus officially converted to Christianity within 300 years of that execution. The very empire that tried to erase him ended up carrying his name to the ends of the earth. No military conquest in history has produced a transformation that sweeping. And it all traces back to a single morning, a single trial, a single cross, on a single hill outside one city in the ancient Near East. So before you dismiss this as a story you already know, let me ask you something. Do you really know what happened that day? Not the stained glass version. Not the version you heard in church as a child. The actual version. The historical version. The forensic version. The one that holds up under the scrutiny of scholars, archaeologists, Roman historians, and forensic pathologists. Here is something most people do not know. The Roman Empire kept meticulous records. They recorded census data, tax collections, military deployments, trial proceedings, and execution orders across every province they controlled. Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect of Judea who signed the death warrant for Jesus, is mentioned not just in the Gospels but in the works of the Roman historian Tacitus, in the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus, and his physical existence was confirmed beyond all doubt in 1961, when archaeologists excavating the ancient theater at Caesarea Maritima uncovered a limestone block with a Latin inscription bearing the words Pontius Pilatus, prefect of Judea. That block of stone, now housed in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, is the earliest non-biblical evidence we have of the man who sent Jesus to the cross. He was real. The trial was real. And the execution was real. The question that we are going to spend the next 3 hours answering is not whether it happened. The evidence for that is, as scholar John Dominic Crossan has stated, as sure as anything historical can ever be. The question we are going to answer is this: what actually happened? What were the forces, political, religious, economic, personal, that drove a Galilean rabbi to a Roman cross? What did that execution physically do to the human body? What did the historical record show? in the hours and days that followed? And why does the story told by a group of terrified, scattered, grieving disciples who had every reason to quietly disappear and never speak of Jesus again end up changing the world more completely than any army, any empire, or any conqueror in all of recorded history ever managed to do? We are going to go through this story the way a great documentary should go through it. Slowly, carefully, with the sources open in front of us. We are going to draw on the 4 gospel accounts, on Josephus and Tacitus and Pliny the Younger, on the Mishnah and the Talmud, on the Dead Sea Scrolls, on the findings published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, on the work of forensic pathologists like Dr. Frederick Zugibe and Dr. William Edwards, and on the archaeological record that has been accumulating for over a century. Nothing will be taken on faith alone in this documentary. Every claim will be grounded in evidence. And what you find when you look at the evidence carefully is something far more extraordinary than most people realize. But before we go any further, before we step into the courtroom of Pontius Pilate, before we walk the road to Golgotha, before we stand at the foot of that cross, I want you to do something. I want you to stop and think about the world this man was born into. Because you cannot understand what happened on that Friday morning without understanding the world that created the conditions for it. The Roman world, the Jewish world, the Jerusalem that existed in the spring of the year 30 AD, and the life of the man who walked into that city, not running, not hiding, not trying to avoid what was coming, but walking straight toward it, as though he knew exactly what it would cost, and had decided long before that it was worth paying. To understand the crucifixion, you have to understand Rome, not the romantic Rome of Hollywood films, with its marble columns gleaming white in the sunlight. The real Rome, the Rome that ruled the ancient world through a combination of military genius, administrative efficiency, and calculated brutality. By the time Jesus was born, around 4 BC, during the reign of Augustus Caesar, Rome controlled an empire that stretched from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of northern Britain, from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the eastern fringes of Mesopotamia. Somewhere between 50 and 90 million people lived under Roman authority, and Rome maintained that authority through one non-negotiable principle: compliance or death. Judea, the territory that included Jerusalem, had been under Roman control since 63 BC, when the Roman general Pompey marched into Jerusalem and desecrated the temple by walking into the Holy of Holies with his soldiers. The Jewish people never forgot that moment. They had been living under the Roman boot for nearly a century by the time Jesus began his ministry, and the resentment had not faded. It had calcified into something deep and dangerous. Multiple Jewish revolts had already occurred, multiple men claiming to be the long-promised Messiah, the one who would liberate Israel from foreign occupation and restore the kingdom of David, had risen and been crushed by Roman military force. The Romans crucified Jewish revolutionaries so routinely that the sight of a man dying on a cross was not shocking to the people of first-century Jerusalem. It was ordinary. It was a warning posted at the edge of civilization that said, "This is what happens when you challenge Rome." Into this world, in a small village called Nazareth in the northern region of Galilee, a carpenter named Joseph and his wife Mary had a son. Nazareth was not a significant town. It does not appear in any Roman administrative records. It does not appear in the works of Josephus. The first-century Jewish world barely noticed it, but the child born there would grow up to become the most significant figure in the history of the civilization that had, for the moment, forgotten he existed. Jesus grew up in a world saturated with Roman occupation. Roman tax collectors extracting money from struggling farmers and fishermen. Roman soldiers enforcing compliance in the streets. Roman crosses visible on the hillsides outside the major towns as a permanent reminder of who was in charge. He grew up knowing in his bones what it meant to live under empire. And the movement he eventually launched was, in the eyes of Rome, a direct threat to the order that empire had built. For approximately 3 years, The scholarly consensus places the beginning of his public ministry around 27 or 28 AD. Jesus traveled through Galilee and Judea, teaching in synagogues and open fields and hillsides, gathering a following that grew from a handful of fishermen and tax collectors into a movement that was attracting enormous crowds. The historian Josephus, writing in the Antiquities of the Jews around 93 AD, describes Jesus as a wise man who performed remarkable deeds, taught those who received truth with pleasure, and gained followers among both Jews and people of Greek origin. That is not a Christian's description. That is a Jewish historian who was loyal to Rome, writing 60 years after the events, describing a man who had clearly left a significant enough mark on history that he could not be ignored. What made Jesus dangerous in the eyes of the established powers, and this is a point that most casual readers of the gospel story miss, was not simply what he taught. It was the combination of what he taught and the scale of his popularity. A lone teacher saying radical things in the desert was not a threat. A teacher saying radical things who could draw tens of thousands of people to a hillside in Galilee, who could walk into Jerusalem during Passover week to massive public acclaim, who had followers in every stratum of society from Roman centurions to fishermen, that was a different matter entirely. That was a political problem. And both the Roman authorities and the Jewish religious establishment recognized it as such. The Jewish religious establishment in Jerusalem in 30 AD was led by a man named Joseph Caiaphas, who had served as high priest since approximately 18 AD and would continue in that role until 36 AD, an extraordinarily long tenure that required exceptional political skill to maintain. In 1990, construction workers in Jerusalem accidentally discovered an ancient burial cave that turned out to contain the ossuary, the bone box, of Caiaphas himself. The inscription reads, "Joseph, son of Caiaphas." It is now housed in the Israel Museum and stands as one of the most remarkable archaeological confirmations of the New Testament record. Caiaphas was not a legendary figure. He was a real man whose bones we have found, who wielded real political power, and who made a real decision about what to do with Jesus of Nazareth. Caiaphas operated in what historians call a delicate equilibrium with Rome. The Romans tolerated Jewish religious practice and allowed the Sanhedrin, the Jewish high council of 71 members, to govern internal religious affairs as long as the Sanhedrin kept order and ensured that Roman tax revenues continued to flow. It was a transactional arrangement, and Caiaphas had maintained it successfully for years. But then Jesus walked into Jerusalem during Passover, the most politically volatile week of the Roman calendar, when the city's population swelled from its normal 60,000 or so residents to somewhere between 100 and 200,000 pilgrims, and drove the money changers out of the temple. That act, deliberate, public, theatrical, aimed directly at the commercial apparatus that Caiaphas oversaw, was the moment the high priest made his decision. Jesus had to go, and so the stage was set. On one side, the most powerful empire in human history, represented in Judea by a politically anxious prefect named Pontius Pilate, who had already come dangerously close to destroying his career by mishandling Jewish sensitivities on 2 prior occasions, and could not afford another incident. On another side, the Sanhedrin, led by a high priest whose authority, revenue, and accommodation with Rome depended on maintaining control of the temple and the religious life of Jerusalem. And in the middle of all of this, a man from Nazareth who had spent 3 years telling people that the kingdom of God was at hand, that the last would be first, that the religious establishment had gotten things badly wrong, and that he himself was the fulfillment of every promise God had ever made to the people of Israel. That collision between those forces and that man is what we are going to trace step by step from the garden where he was arrested to the hill where he died. It is the spring of 30 AD, the month of Nisan on the Jewish calendar, which corresponds to March or April on ours. Passover is approaching, and the roads into Jerusalem are thick with pilgrims traveling from every corner of the ancient world. For observant Jews, Passover was not merely a religious holiday. It was the central act of national memory, the annual commemoration of the night when God freed their ancestors from slavery in Egypt. And every Passover, That memory carried a charge that the Romans watched carefully, because the same God who once liberated Israel from Egypt might at any moment decide to liberate Israel from Rome. The city that Jesus rode into on what we now call Palm Sunday was a powder keg. It had been a powder keg for decades. And on that Sunday morning, Jesus struck a match. The account of the entry into Jerusalem is recorded in all four Gospels, and the details are not incidental. They are loaded with meaning that every person in that crowd would have understood immediately. Jesus chose to enter the city riding on a donkey. That specific choice is a quotation from the Hebrew prophet Zechariah, writing 5 centuries earlier, who had said that the king of Israel would come to Jerusalem riding on a donkey, humble and gentle, bringing salvation, the crowds throwing their cloaks on the road before him. That was a gesture drawn from 2 Kings chapter 9, which describes the anointing of the king Jehu, often when people spread their garments on the road before the newly appointed king. The crowds cutting palm branches and shouting, "Hosanna," which in Hebrew means "save us now," were not simply cheering for a popular teacher. They were performing a coronation ceremony. In a city full of Roman soldiers, watching from the garrison of the Antonia fortress, the message was unmistakable. This man is being received as a king. The next morning, Jesus did something that made his arrest not merely likely, but inevitable. He walked into the temple, the holiest site in the Jewish world, the economic and spiritual center of Jerusalem. And he drove out the money changers and the merchants who had set up operations in the outer courtyard, known as the Court of the Gentiles. He overturned their tables. He scattered their coins. He drove out the animals being sold for sacrifice. And he said, and this is recorded in all 3 synoptic gospels, that the temple was supposed to be a house of prayer but had been made into a den of thieves. Now, this was not merely a religious protest. The money-changing operation in the temple was directly connected to Caiaphas and the priestly establishment. Pilgrims coming from outside Judea could not use their foreign currency to pay the temple tax. They had to exchange it for the official Tyrian shekel, and the exchange rate favored the house. The dove sellers and animal merchants paid fees to the temple authorities for the right to conduct business there. Caiaphas had a financial stake in everything Jesus had just upended. The Gospel of Mark tells us that after the temple incident, the chief priests and the scribes heard what had happened and looked for a way to kill him. They were afraid of him because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. That last sentence is crucial. They wanted to arrest him immediately, but they could not do so publicly without risking a riot. Jesus was too popular. The crowd was too large. During Passover week, with a city at twice or 3 times its normal population, the Romans' greatest fear was a public disturbance. Caiaphas knew that if he moved against Jesus openly, in daylight in front of the crowds, he risked exactly the kind of disturbance that would bring the Roman garrison down on all of them, and potentially cost Caiaphas his own position. He needed to move quietly, in the dark, away from the crowds. He needed an insider. His insider arrived. His name was Judas Iscariot, and he was one of the 12 men who had been traveling with Jesus for the entirety of his 3-year ministry. The Gospels record that Judas went to the chief priests and asked what they would give him if he handed Jesus over to them. They paid him 30 pieces of silver, 30 shekels, which according to the book of Exodus was the compensation owed for accidentally killing a slave. Scholars have debated the motive of Judas for 2,000 years. Was he disillusioned, believing Jesus was not going to bring the military liberation of Israel that many expected the Messiah to bring? Was he greedy? Was he, as some theologians have argued, fulfilling a role he understood to be necessary? The text does not tell us clearly. What it tells us is that from that moment on, Judas watched for his opportunity, and he did not have to wait long. On Thursday evening of that week, the 14th of Nisan on the Jewish calendar, Jesus gathered his 12 closest followers in an upper room in Jerusalem to share the Passover meal. The details of that evening, recorded across all 4 Gospels and referenced by the Apostle Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians, a letter that most New Testament scholars date to within 20 years of the events themselves, are among the most carefully documented hours in the ancient world. During the meal, Jesus did something that would echo through 2,000 years of Christian worship. He took a piece of unleavened bread, broke it, and said, "This is my body, given for you." He took a cup of wine and said, "This is my blood of the covenant, poured out for many, for the forgiveness of sins." In a religious culture saturated with the language of temple sacrifice, in a city where lambs were being slaughtered by the thousands for Passover, the symbolism was not subtle. Jesus was framing his own imminent death as a sacrificial act, and at least some of the men in that room understood what he was saying. After the meal, they walked to a garden on the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives called Gethsemane, which in Aramaic means oil press. It was a place Jesus apparently visited often enough that Judas knew exactly where to find him. What happened in that garden in the hours before his arrest is one of the most psychologically profound passages in the entire New Testament. And Jesus separated from most of his disciples and prayed. And the prayer recorded in all three synoptic Gospels is not the confident declaration of a man who has everything under control. It is the anguished cry of a man who knows what is coming and is asking if there is any other way. The Gospel of Luke, written by someone historians believe had access to medical sources, records a physical detail that is both shocking and medically recognized. Luke writes that Jesus' sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. This is a genuine physiological condition called hematidrosis, documented in medical literature, which can occur under conditions of extreme psychological stress when capillary blood vessels rupture into the sweat glands. Whatever Jesus experienced in that garden, it was not casual, it was not performed. It was a man on the edge of something terrible, choosing to walk toward it anyway. And then the torches appeared through the trees. The Gospel of John, which many historians believe reflects eyewitness testimony, possibly from the Apostle John himself, notes that a large detachment of soldiers arrived with Judas, carrying lanterns, torches, and weapons. The detail of soldiers in John's account suggests the presence of Roman military, alongside the temple guards, reflecting the collusion between the Sanhedrin and Pilate's administration that ran through this entire proceeding. Judas approached Jesus and greeted him with a kiss, the agreed-upon signal to identify the man they were looking for in the darkness of the garden. The disciples panicked. One of them drew a sword and cut off the ear of a man named Malchus, a servant of the high priest. Jesus stopped the violence, and in the account recorded by Luke the physician, he healed the man's ear. And then, with his disciples scattering into the darkness, Jesus allowed the soldiers to arrest him. He went with them, without a struggle. As if he had been expecting this moment all along, what happened between the arrest in Gethsemane and the crucifixion on Golgotha is one of the most legally extraordinary sequences in the ancient world. Jesus faced not one trial, but 4 separate hearings in the space of a single night and morning, 2 before Jewish authorities and 2 before Roman ones. And at least 2 of those hearings violated the legal standards of both Jewish and Roman law in ways that scholars have documented in exhaustive detail. The entire proceeding, as recorded in the Gospels and cross-referenced with the Mishnah's rules for capital cases, was rushed, irregular, and driven by political urgency rather than judicial process. The people who orchestrated it knew it was irregular. They did not care. They needed it done before the crowds woke up and before Jesus could rally his followers. They needed it done before dawn. The first stop was the house of Annas. Annas had served as high priest from 6 to 15 AD when he was deposed by the Roman governor. But in the world of first-century Jerusalem, a former high priest did not simply retire into obscurity. Annas was the patriarch of the most powerful priestly family in the city. 5 of his sons and his son-in-law, Caiaphas, had all served as high priest. He remained, in every practical sense, the most influential man in the Jewish religious establishment, pulling strings from behind the scenes. The Gospel of John records that Jesus was first brought to Annas for what appears to have been a preliminary interrogation, an off-the-books conversation that was not a formal trial at all but was designed to produce the basis for one. When Jesus pointed out that he had taught openly in the synagogues and the temple, and asked why he was being questioned privately rather than having witnesses brought against him, a temple officer struck him across the face. It was a small moment, but a revealing one. This proceeding had no interest in fairness. From Annas, Jesus was sent to Caiaphas, where the Sanhedrin, or a portion of it, had assembled. The Mishnah, the codification of Jewish oral law, is explicit on the procedure for capital cases. They could not be conducted at night. They had to be heard before a full quorum of 23 judges at a minimum. 2 independent witnesses whose testimony agreed precisely were required to establish guilt. And a conviction could not be confirmed until the following day, so that the judges had time to sleep and potentially reconsider. Every single one of those requirements was violated in the trial before Caiaphas. The hearing was held at night. The witnesses brought against Jesus gave conflicting testimony. The Gospel of Mark records plainly that many testified falsely against him, and their testimonies did not agree. The proceedings moved with desperate speed toward a predetermined conclusion. Caiaphas, frustrated by the failure of the false witnesses to establish a consistent charge, and resorted to direct questioning. He put Jesus under oath before the living God and asked him plainly, "Are you the Christ, the Son of God?" What happened next is the most theologically explosive moment in the entire trial narrative. Jesus answered in the affirmative, and then quoted directly from the book of Daniel and from Psalm 110, saying that the high priest would see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven. If you understand what those texts meant to a first-century Jewish audience, Daniel's vision of the one who comes before the Ancient of Days and is given dominion over all nations, Psalm 110's image of the one seated at God's right hand, you understand why Caiaphas tore his robes. This was not a general claim to be a great teacher or a prophet. This was a claim to a position of cosmic authority that, in Caiaphas's understanding, could only be absolute blasphemy or absolute truth. The Sanhedrin declared him worthy of death, but they could not carry out that sentence. Only Rome could authorize crucifixion. And so, at first light, they bound Jesus and led him to the Praetorium, the official residence and administrative headquarters of Pontius Pilate. This is where the jurisdiction shifts, and where the charges shift with it. The accusation of blasphemy that had worked before the Sanhedrin was useless before a Roman court. Rome had no interest in Jewish theological disputes, so the chief priests reframed the charges for Roman consumption. They accused Jesus of 3 things: of misleading the nation, of opposing payment of taxes to Caesar, and, most critically, of claiming to be a king. That last charge was the one that mattered. In Roman law, claiming royal authority without the sanction of Rome was the crime of maiestas, treason against the state. It carried the death penalty, and it was, in the eyes of Pilate, something that required attention. Pontius Pilate is one of the most complex figures in the entire Passion narrative, and the portrait the Gospels paint of him is confirmed in its broad strokes by what we know of him from other historical sources. Josephus records 2 prior incidents in which Pilate had managed to enrage the Jewish population of Jerusalem so severely that Rome had to intervene. Once when he brought Roman military standards bearing the image of Caesar into Jerusalem, violating the Jewish prohibition against graven images, and once when he raided the temple treasury to fund a water aqueduct project. Both times, mass protest forced him to back down. Philo of Alexandria, writing around the same period, describes Pilate as a man prone to bribes, insults, robberies, outrages, wanton injuries, and savage ferocity. By the spring of 30 AD, Pilate's patron in Rome, the powerful Praetorian prefect Sejanus, had been executed for plotting against the Emperor Tiberius. Pilate had lost his political protector. He was vulnerable. He could not afford another complaint to Rome from the Jewish leadership. The private interview between Pilate and Jesus, recorded in John's Gospel, is unlike anything else in the ancient historical record. Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answers a question with a question. Are you asking because you actually want to know, or because someone told you to ask? Pilate, exasperated, says, "I am not a Jew. Your own people handed you over to me. "What have you done?" And Jesus says something that Pilate clearly did not expect. He says that his kingdom is not of this world, that if it were, his followers would be fighting to free him. Pilate hears this and goes back out to the crowd and says, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." He says this, on the record. 3 times in Luke's account, Pilate declares Jesus innocent. And then, in one of the most consequential acts of political cowardice in human history, he hands him over anyway. The mechanism of that cowardice is worth understanding. After Pilate's initial declaration of innocence, the crowd, led by representatives of the chief priests, intensified their demands. They told Pilate that Jesus had been stirring up the people from Galilee to Jerusalem. When Pilate heard the word Galilee, he found an exit. He could send Jesus to Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, who happened to be in Jerusalem for the festival. This was Pilate attempting to offload a politically dangerous problem onto someone else's desk. Herod Antipas, the same man who had ordered the beheading of John the Baptist, had long been curious about Jesus. He questioned him at length. Jesus said nothing in response, not a word. Herod mocked him, dressed him in an elegant robe as a joke about his supposed kingship, and sent him back to Pilate. The 2 men, who had previously been political rivals, became friends that day over their shared handling of Jesus. It is one of the more darkly ironic details in the entire narrative. Back before Pilate, with no legal grounds for execution and a crowd growing louder by the minute, Pilate attempted one more maneuver. There was a Passover custom of releasing one prisoner to the crowd. Pilate offered them a choice: Jesus, or a man named Barabbas, who had been imprisoned for his involvement in an insurrection and a murder in the city. Barabbas, in Aramaic, means son of the Father. The crowd, stirred up by the chief priests according to Mark's account, chose Barabbas. Pilate asked what he should do with the one they called the King of the Jews, and the crowd answered with a word that has echoed through history: "Crucify him." And then the crowd delivered the line that sealed it. According to John's Gospel, they said to Pilate, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." The phrase "friend of Caesar," amicus Caesaris, was not merely a social observation. It was a specific legal and political title in the Roman system. To be told you are not a friend of Caesar was to be threatened with denunciation to Rome. Pilate had already lost his patron. He could not withstand a formal accusation of protecting a man who claimed to be a rival king. He ordered a basin of water, washed his hands before the crowd in a gesture of symbolic disavowal. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said, and handed Jesus over to be flogged and crucified. The decision had taken perhaps 3 hours from the first hearing. The death sentence had been signed by a man who had publicly declared the condemned innocent, and the machinery of Rome moved immediately to carry it out. Before we walk the road to Golgotha, we need to spend time, real time, with what happened to Jesus' body in the hour before he was nailed to the cross, because the flogging, as administered by Roman soldiers, was not the kind of punishment most people picture when they hear the word whipping. It was a systematic, methodical destruction of the human body that in many cases killed the victim before the crucifixion was ever reached. And understanding it is essential to understanding everything that came after. The Romans had a specific instrument for this purpose called the flagrum, or flagellum. It was not a simple leather strap. It was a whip made of several leather thongs of varying lengths, woven or tied at the ends, with small balls of lead and sharp fragments of bone. The victim was stripped and tied with his arms raised to a post so that his back, buttocks, and legs were fully exposed. 2 soldiers called lictors stood on either side of him and administered the blows in alternating strikes. The Jews, by law recorded in the book of Deuteronomy, limited their floggings to 40 stripes, and the Pharisees, in their characteristic caution about accidentally exceeding the legal limit, counted only to 39. The Romans had no such limit. They struck as many times as they chose, and they struck with full force. A 1986 article published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, written by physicians who had studied the crucifixion from a medical perspective, describes what the flagrum did to the human body in clinical terms that are worth hearing. The iron balls, with Each blow caused deep bruising and contusions. The leather thongs cut into the skin. As the flogging continued, the lacerations cut through the skin and into the subcutaneous tissue beneath it. With continued blows, the underlying skeletal muscle was torn open, exposing bleeding ribbons of flesh. The blood loss from this alone was significant enough to produce the early stages of what physicians call hypovolemic shock, a dangerous drop in blood pressure caused by insufficient blood volume. The article notes that it is not surprising that victims of Roman floggings seldom survived. Jesus was flogged by Roman soldiers operating without the legal constraints that Jewish law imposed, and then immediately afterward, he was handed over to be crucified. After the flogging, the soldiers added what the Gospels describe as a crown of thorns pressed onto his head. The scalp is one of the most vascular areas of the human body. It bleeds heavily even from minor wounds. The thorn plant most likely used, according to biblical botanists, was Josephus spinacristi, a shrub common to the Jerusalem area with thorns that can reach up to an inch in length. Pressing a woven crown of these thorns down onto the scalp would have driven multiple deep punctures into the tissue and produced copious bleeding over the face. The soldiers also put a purple robe on him, the color worn by royalty, and mockingly saluted him as King of the Jews, striking him on the head with a staff that drove the thorns deeper and spitting on him. The robe was later ripped off before the crucifixion began, tearing open wounds that had begun to clot. At this point, Jesus had not eaten or drunk since the night before. The combination of the beatings, the crown of thorns, and the flogging had already set in motion a process of severe dehydration and cardiovascular deterioration. And he still had not yet reached the cross. The sign, what the Romans called the titulus, was now prepared. Roman law required that the specific charge against a condemned man be publicly declared at his execution. Pilate ordered the sign to be written in 3 languages: Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, the languages of religion, of law, and of international commerce in the ancient world. The charge written on that sign was not blasphemer. It was not insurrectionist. It was Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. 4 words in Latin: Jesus Nazarenus, Rex Judiorum, the initials of which, INRI, have appeared in Christian art ever since. The chief priests protested to Pilate, asking him to change the sign to read that he had claimed to be the King of the Jews rather than stating it as a fact. Pilate refused. What he had written, and Jesus, carrying the crossbar of his own execution instrument, began the walk to Golgotha. The Romans called it the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering. It was approximately 600 meters from the Praetorium to the execution site at Golgotha, winding through the crowded streets of Jerusalem during the most populated week of the year. 600 meters, less than half a mile. Under normal circumstances, a healthy man could walk that distance in 10 minutes. Jesus, in the condition described by the medical record, having been awake all night, having undergone hematidrosis in Gethsemane, having been beaten multiple times, having lost significant blood through the flogging, already in the early stages of hypovolemic shock, could barely stand. The Gospel accounts record that he fell under the weight of the patibulum, the heavy wooden crossbar that each condemned man was required to carry to the execution site. According to the medical analysis of Dr. Frederick Zugebe, the crossbar alone would have weighed between 75 and 125 pounds. Bearing that weight, in that physical condition, up an unpaved, uneven road through the heat of a Jerusalem morning, would have been agonizing beyond anything most of us can imagine. When Jesus fell, the Roman soldiers in charge of the execution detail made a practical decision. They could not delay the execution to let him recover. They looked into the crowd for a strong man to press into service. The law that authorized this, the right of Roman soldiers to conscript civilians for 1 mile of labor service, is the same law Jesus had referenced in the Sermon on the Mount when he told his followers that if a soldier compels them to go 1 mile, they should go 2. The man they chose was Simon of Cyrene. Cyrene was a city in what is now Libya in North Africa, who was coming in from the countryside, possibly arriving in Jerusalem for Passover. Simon of Cyrene is identified in the Gospel of Mark not just by name, but by the names of his two sons, Alexander and Rufus. Historians believe that Mark includes those names because Alexander and Rufus were known to the Roman Christian community to whom Mark was writing. Simon carried the crossbar for a stranger that morning. He never expected to end up in this story. Golgotha. The word is Aramaic, and it means the place of the skull. In Latin, the translation is Calvaria, which gives us the English word Calvary. The precise location of the original Golgotha is debated by archaeologists. But the weight of scholarly and archaeological evidence favors the site now occupied by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, a site that was outside the city walls in the 1st century, which Roman law required, and which has been venerated as the place of the crucifixion since at least the early 2nd century. It was a permanent execution site. The upright beam of the cross stood there routinely, used and reused for multiple executions. This was standard Roman practice, not because timber was scarce enough in the Jerusalem area that Josephus records Roman soldiers traveling 10 miles from the city to find wood for siege machinery during the Jewish War of 66 to 70 AD. The condemned man carried only the crossbar. The upright post waited at Golgotha. Before the nailing began, the Gospels record that Jesus was offered wine mixed with myrrh. This was not a Roman custom. This was a Jewish act of mercy. There is a reference in the Talmud to the women of Jerusalem providing a drugged drink to condemned men to deaden the pain. It was a mild analgesic. Jesus tasted it and refused it. This detail, so small in the narrative, carries enormous weight. He was choosing to face what was coming fully conscious. Whatever was about to happen to him, he intended to experience it with complete awareness. Think about that for a moment. After the night he had endured, the arrest, the beatings, the trials, the flogging, the crown of thorns, the long walk through the streets, the first merciful thing offered to him was a drink to blunt the edge of what was coming. And he refused it. The nailing. This is the point at which the forensic record becomes particularly important and particularly precise. Archaeological evidence for 1st century Roman crucifixion is extremely limited. For a practical reason, iron was expensive, and after an execution, the nails were typically extracted from the body and reused, which makes the discovery in 1968 all the more remarkable. During construction work in Jerusalem, archaeologists discovered an ancient burial cave from the 1st century containing the remains of a man named Yehohanan bar Hagkol, who had been crucified. The nail was still in place, an 11.5-centimeter iron nail driven through the right heel bone, with traces of olive wood from the cross still attached. This is the only direct physical evidence of crucifixion ever found in archaeological excavations, and it tells us something important about exactly how the nails were placed. The popular image of Jesus nailed through the palms of his hands is almost certainly anatomically incorrect. And this is not a matter of theological debate, but of simple physics. Medical experiments conducted on cadavers have consistently shown that the palms cannot support the weight of a hanging body. The tissue tears, the nails pull through. For crucifixion to work as an execution method, slow, prolonged, yet requiring hours for the victim to die, the nails had to be placed where the body weight could be supported. Forensic pathologists, drawing on the work of Dr. Pierre Barbet and later Dr. Frederick Zugib, have concluded that the nails were most likely driven through the wrist area, specifically through a space between the carpal bones near the wrist called Destot space, which can support the full weight of a human body. The Gospel accounts use the Greek word chir, meaning hand, which in the ancient world included the wrist as part of what was considered the hand. The nail placement in the wrist would also have contacted the median nerve, producing an intense, radiating, burning pain that modern physicians describe as among the most severe pain the human nervous system can produce. The feet, or in the case of the Yehohanan remains, near the heels, were nailed separately. The legs were bent at the knees and twisted to one side so that both feet could be secured with a single nail through the heel bones or the ankles to the upright post. Then the crossbar was lifted and attached to the upright, and the full weight of the body was on the nails. The titulus, the sign with the charge, was nailed above his head, which required the upright to extend above the crossbar, confirming the traditional cross shape. And Jesus was crucified between two men described in the Gospels as thieves or criminals. The word used in some translations is lestai, which can mean robbers, but was also used for revolutionary fighters against Rome. The physiology of what crucifixion does to the human body is something the world spent nearly 2 millennia deliberately not looking at too closely. It was not until the 20th century that medical professionals published detailed analyses of the mechanism of death, and even then there is continuing debate. The broad consensus, as summarized in the Journal of the American Medical Association, is that the primary cause of death in crucifixion is a combination of hypovolemic shock from blood loss and exhaustion, asphyxia. When the body is hanging from outstretched arms, the normal breathing mechanism is severely compromised. To exhale, the victim must push up with his feet, pushing against the nail through his heels, in order to relieve the pressure on his chest. This act of pushing upward is enormously painful, but if he does not do it, he cannot exhale. Each breath requires a deliberate, agonizing act of resistance against the nails. And over time, as the muscles fatigue from blood loss and exhaustion, those acts become harder and harder, until finally the chest cannot expand anymore, and the victim suffocates. This is why the Roman soldiers, when they wanted to hasten the death of crucifixion victims, as they did on the afternoon of the crucifixion, because Passover began at sundown and Jewish law prohibited bodies from remaining exposed overnight during a holy day, broke their legs. The breaking of legs with a heavy mallet was called the crucifixion. Once the legs were broken, the victim could no longer push himself up to breathe. Asphyxiation came within minutes. The Gospel of John records that the soldiers broke the legs of the two men crucified alongside Jesus, but did not break Jesus' legs, because when they came to him, they saw that he was already dead. One soldier instead thrust a spear into his side to confirm death. John records that blood and water flowed from the wound. Medical analysis of this detail has generally concluded that the blood and watery fluid, serum, is consistent with what would be expected from a spear thrust into the chest cavity of someone who had died from the combination of traumatic and cardiovascular stress described above. The Roman soldiers who administered that spear thrust were men whose profession was killing people. They confirmed he was dead. Now let us talk about what Jesus said while he was on the cross. The Gospels record 7 separate statements, sometimes called the 7 last words, spoken during the hours of the crucifixion. Biblical scholars have devoted enormous attention to these statements, not only for their theological significance, but for what they reveal about the conscious, deliberate character of the man speaking them under conditions that would have made coherent speech almost impossible. The first words, recorded only in Luke: "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." This was spoken, Luke indicates, during the nailing itself, perhaps the most extraordinary statement in the entire Passion narrative. A man having iron nails driven through his wrists, praying for the forgiveness of the men doing it. The second statement was to the man being crucified alongside him, who, according to Luke, had defended Jesus to the other criminal and asked to be remembered when Jesus came into his kingdom. Jesus answered him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." This is the most personal promise in the crucifixion narrative, given not to the disciples who had followed him for 3 years, not to his mother or his closest friends, but to a dying criminal who had expressed faith in the final hours of his life. The third statement was addressed to his mother Mary and to the beloved disciple, traditionally identified as John, who were standing at the foot of the cross. Jesus entrusted his mother to John's care and John's to Mary. Even hanging from the cross, with hours remaining before death, he was making practical provision for someone he would leave behind. The fourth statement, the one that has troubled theologians and comforted sufferers more than any other, was spoken in Aramaic and preserved phonetically in both Matthew and Mark. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? My God, Why have you forsaken me?" These words are the opening line of Psalm 22, a psalm of David that begins in anguish and ends in vindication, in which the psalmist is surrounded by enemies who divide his garments and cast lots for his clothing, who mock him and say that God has abandoned him, and who eventually sees deliverance and proclaims God's faithfulness before the congregation. Every Jew in earshot of that cry would have known the psalm instantly. Whether Jesus was expressing a genuine feeling of abandonment or was deliberately invoking the full arc of the psalm, or both, is a question that has occupied theologians for 2,000 years. What is beyond question is that the cry was real. The fifth statement, "I'm thirsty," is the only physical complaint Jesus voices in the entire crucifixion narrative. It is brief and almost clinical in its simplicity after everything that came before it. A soldier soaked a sponge in wine vinegar and lifted it on a stalk of hyssop for Jesus to drink. The sixth statement is the one that, more than any other, reverberates through history. John records that after receiving the wine vinegar, Jesus said, "It is finished." The Greek word is tetelestai, a single word, perfect tense, which carries the meaning of something not merely ended, but completed, accomplished, brought to its full conclusion. Historians of the ancient world note that tetelestai was written on business receipts and tax documents in the Roman world to indicate that a debt had been paid in full. The seventh and final statement, recorded in Luke, was a quiet one. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." These are the words of Psalm 31, verse 5, a verse that the Talmud records as a bedtime prayer for Jewish children, learned from childhood, the last prayer of the day before sleep. Jesus died quoting the words his mother may have taught him to say before he closed his eyes as a boy in Nazareth. The Gospel accounts record that at the moment of Jesus' death, the veil of the temple, the massive curtain that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies, was torn from top to bottom. Josephus, in his description of the temple, indicates that this curtain was approximately 60 feet tall and 4 inches thick, woven of such density that it required 300 priests to handle it. The theological significance, that the barrier between humanity and the presence of God had been removed, has been central to Christian theology ever since. An earthquake is also recorded, and this is not merely a theological claim. Geologists studying sediment cores from the Dead Sea have identified a significant seismic event in the region dating to between 26 and 36 AD. The tectonic record of the ancient Levant corroborates the gospel account of an earthquake at the time of the crucifixion. In Roman practice, the bodies of crucified criminals were typically left on the cross for days as an extended warning to the population. This was not what happened to Jesus. A man named Joseph of Arimathea, described by all 4 Gospels as a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin who had not consented to the council's decision against Jesus, went to Pilate privately and asked for permission to take the body. Pilate, before granting the request, asked a centurion to confirm that Jesus was actually dead, and he was apparently surprised that Jesus had died so quickly. Crucifixion typically lasted longer, sometimes days. The centurion confirmed death. Pilate granted the request, and Joseph of Arimathea took the body. He was accompanied, according to John's Gospel, by Nicodemus, another member of the Sanhedrin, who brought with him approximately 75 pounds of a mixture of myrrh and aloes. The body was wrapped in linen cloths with the spices placed between the layers, in accordance with Jewish burial custom, and it was placed in a new tomb, one that had never been used, that had been cut from rock in a garden near the execution site. A large stone was rolled across the entrance. The next day, the Saturday Sabbath, the chief priests and Pharisees went to Pilate and said something that tells us a great deal about how seriously the religious establishment took Jesus' claims, even after his death. They told Pilate that Jesus had said, while he was still alive, that after 3 days he would rise again. And they asked Pilate to order the tomb secured until the 3rd day, so that his disciples could not come and steal the body and then tell the people that he had risen from the dead. Pilate gave them a guard detail and told them to go and make the tomb as secure as they knew how. The men who had worked all night to have Jesus executed were now, the very next morning, worried about the resurrection prediction he had made. They took it seriously enough to request military intervention. They were afraid of the story that might emerge if the tomb was found empty on the third day. The guard placed at the tomb was most likely a Roman custodia, a military unit that typically comprised between 4 and 16 soldiers, with each man trained to defend against several opponents simultaneously. Roman military law on this point was unambiguous. A soldier who deserted his post, fell asleep on duty, or failed to prevent the escape of a prisoner faced the death penalty. These were not casual watchmen. They were professional soldiers with their lives on the line. The tomb was also sealed with an official Roman seal, the breaking of which was itself a capital offense. Everything that could have been done to prevent the body from being removed had been done. And yet, when the women, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and others, arrived at the tomb early on the first day of the week, the stone had been moved, the tomb was empty, and the burial cloths that had wrapped the body were lying there, undisturbed. The disciples' reaction to the news of the empty tomb was not immediate triumphant proclamation. It was confusion and disbelief. Mary Magdalene's first assumption, recorded in John 20, was that someone had taken the body. When Peter and John ran to the tomb and found it empty, they did not immediately declare the resurrection. The disciples, in the days immediately following the crucifixion, were huddled in Jerusalem behind locked doors for fear of the Jewish authorities. These are not the actions of men who had successfully stolen a body and were now confidently constructing a theological cover story. These are men who are terrified and confused and have no clear idea what has happened. What transformed them was a series of encounters that the earliest Christian records describe as appearances of the risen Jesus. Paul of Tarsus, writing in his first letter to the Corinthians, most New Testament scholars date to within 20 years of the crucifixion, transmits what historians recognize as an even earlier creedal formula, possibly dating to within just a few years of the events themselves. Paul writes that Jesus appeared to Peter, then to the 12 disciples, then to more than 500 people at one time, most of whom, he notes, were still alive at the time of writing, implying that anyone who doubted the claim could go and ask them, then to James, the brother of Jesus, then to Paul himself. This is not a legend that grew slowly over centuries. This is a claim being made publicly, in a letter intended for circulation, within living memory of the events, by a man who explicitly invites verification. For 2,000 years, the central question of the crucifixion narrative has not been whether Jesus died on the cross. He died. The Romans confirmed it. The disciples confirmed it. The burial confirms it. The question is what happened next. And when you approach that question the way a historian approaches any historical question, by looking at the evidence, examining the possible explanations, and asking which explanation best accounts for all the facts, you encounter something that has frustrated skeptics and sustained believers in equal measure. Because the evidence, when you lay it all out, she is more interesting and more complex than either side usually acknowledges. Let us start with the one thing that no one in the ancient world disputed. The tomb was empty. Not a single source, not Jewish, not Roman, not Christian, records any claim that the body of Jesus was in the tomb on the third day. The enemies of the early Christian movement did not say the disciples were lying about the empty tomb. What they said, according to Matthew 28, which records the chief priests' instructions to the soldiers who reported back to them, was that the disciples had stolen the body while the soldiers slept. That was their counter-narrative, not that the tomb was still occupied. The tomb was empty. Everyone agreed on that. The entire dispute was over why it was empty. So let us examine the competing explanations. The first, and historically the most persistent, is the theft theory, the idea that the disciples stole the body and then fabricated the resurrection story. There are several significant problems with it. The first is the Roman guard. We have already established that the soldiers guarding the tomb were under pain of death for dereliction of duty. The idea that a group of fishermen and tradespeople who had fled in terror from the Garden of Gethsemane, who were hiding behind locked doors for fear of the authorities, somehow organized themselves in 48 hours into a force capable of overpowering a Roman military guard, and rolling away a sealed stone without detection requires a considerable suspension of disbelief. The second problem with the theft theory is the subsequent behavior of the disciples. If they had stolen the body and knew the resurrection was a fabrication, they went on to build their lives, and ultimately to lose their lives, on a story they knew to be false. The historical record indicates that the vast majority of the original disciples died as martyrs, rather than recant their testimony about the resurrection. Peter was crucified. Paul was beheaded. James, the son of Zebedee, was executed by Herod. James, the brother of Jesus, was stoned. People die for things they believe to be true. People do not die for things they know to be fabrications. There is no historical parallel, none, for a group of conspirators maintaining a shared lie in the face of torture and execution without a single defection or deathbed confession. The second major theory is the wrong tomb theory, the suggestion that the women, arriving in the pre-dawn darkness on that Sunday morning, simply went to the wrong tomb, found it empty, and assumed the resurrection. The immediate problem with this theory is that multiple people knew perfectly well where the correct tomb was. Joseph of Arimathea, who owned it; Nicodemus, who helped place the body there; Mary Magdalene and the other women, who according to Mark 15:47 watched as the body was placed in the tomb and the stone rolled over the entrance. Even if we discard all of that, the Sanhedrin and Pilate's administration knew exactly where the tomb was, because they had sent soldiers to guard it. If the disciples were telling people the wrong tomb was empty, the authorities needed only to walk to the right tomb and produce the body. They never did. The third major theory is the swoon theory, the suggestion that Jesus did not actually die on the cross but merely lost consciousness, was placed in the cool tomb while still alive, recovered and emerged, with the disciples interpreting his reappearance as resurrection. Every forensic and medical analysis of the crucifixion has concluded that Jesus was dead when taken down from the cross. Not possibly dead. Dead. He had been through a flogging that would have killed many men on its own. He had been on the cross for approximately 6 hours. A Roman soldier thrust a spear into his chest cavity and confirmed death. The 19th century skeptic David Strauss, himself no friend of Orthodox Christianity, dismissed the swoon theory with a precision that has never really been answered. A man who came out of the tomb in the condition that Jesus would have been in after the ordeal described, pale, limping, bleeding, barely able to walk, would not have inspired his disciples to proclaim him the conqueror of death and the Lord of life. He would have inspired them to call a physician. Which leaves us with the explanation that the disciples themselves gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead on the third day, that he appeared alive to them over a period of 40 days, and that they had witnessed it with their own eyes. What historical investigation can do is establish that the empty tomb, the post-resurrection appearances, and the transformation of the disciples are historical facts that require explanation. The resurrection is the only explanation that the disciples themselves offered, and it is the only explanation that, as Cambridge historian N.T. Wright has argued in his landmark study, the resurrection of the Son of God adequately accounts for all the evidence. I want to be honest with you about something. If you came into this documentary as a skeptic, nothing said here is going to compel you to believe in the resurrection. What it can do is tell you what the evidence says. And the evidence for the crucifixion is, as scholars across the theological spectrum agree, among the most firmly established facts of ancient history. There's one more piece of historical evidence that deserves attention, and it is arguably the most powerful confirmation of all. What happened to the movement? Jesus died on a cross at the hands of the Roman Empire. By every historical precedent, his movement should have ended with his death. When Judas the Galilean was killed by Rome, a generation before Jesus, his movement died with him. When Theudas was killed by Rome, a generation after Jesus, his movement died with him. Every other messianic movement in first-century Judaism that ended in the death of its leader also ended in the death of the movement. There is no parallel in Jewish history to what happened after the crucifixion of Jesus. Instead of scattering permanently, Instead of returning to their fishing boats and their tax collection posts and quietly forgetting the whole thing, the disciples of Jesus expanded. Within weeks of the crucifixion, they were publicly proclaiming the resurrection in Jerusalem. Within years, the movement had spread across the Roman Empire. Within 3 centuries, the emperor of Rome himself had converted. The empire that crucified Jesus ended up building churches in his name on every continent. In the year 70 AD, exactly 40 years after the crucifixion, the Roman general Titus marched his legions into Jerusalem and destroyed the temple that Caiaphas had spent his career protecting. The building that Jesus had said, in the days before his death, would be torn down until not one stone remained standing on another. That temple was leveled. The Arch of Titus, still standing in Rome today, depicts Roman soldiers carrying the temple's golden menorah in triumph through the streets of the city. The high priesthood that had condemned Jesus ceased to exist the day the temple fell. Pontius Pilate had been removed from office by Rome years earlier, in 36 AD, recalled in disgrace following a massacre he ordered of Samaritan pilgrims. Caiaphas was removed from the high priesthood by the governor Vitellius in the same year. The 2 men most responsible, in historical terms, for the crucifixion of Jesus were both gone from power within 6 years of the event, and the movement they had tried to destroy was still growing. By the end of the 1st century, Christian communities had been established in Rome, in Corinth, in Ephesus, in Antioch, in Alexandria, and across the length and breadth of the Roman Empire. By 312 AD, the Emperor Constantine attributed his military victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge to the God of the Christians and issued the Edict of Milan, granting full religious tolerance to Christians throughout the empire. By 380 AD, under the Emperor Theodosius, Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. The empire that crucified Jesus had, within 3.5 centuries, converted. From that point forward, the cross, the instrument of execution that Rome had used to terrorize and humiliate, became the most widely recognized symbol in Western civilization. Those ideas did not come from Rome's military genius. They came, traced back to their source, from a rabbi from Nazareth who spent 3 years telling people that the last would be first, that the powerful would be brought low and the humble would be lifted up, and that God was not found in the performance of elaborate rituals, but in the care of the sick, the hungry, the prisoner, the stranger. There is something worth saying here that is easy to overlook when we have spent this long examining evidence and forensic detail and historical cross-references. The crucifixion of Jesus is not merely a historical event to be analyzed. For more than 2 billion people alive today, it is the defining event of their own story, the moment when they believe the God who created the universe chose to enter that universe in human form and endure the worst that human cruelty and political cowardice could produce, not to destroy those who inflicted it, but to forgive them. The prayer from the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing," is not a peripheral detail. It is, for Christian theology, the entire point. The crucifixion is not a tragedy. It is, in the framework of Christian faith, the most deliberate act of love in the history of creation. I recognize that there are people watching this documentary who do not share that faith. People who have looked at the evidence and arrived at different conclusions. People who approach the resurrection with skepticism or outright disbelief. The historical case for the crucifixion itself, for the reality of the man, the reality of the trial, the reality of the execution, the reality of the empty tomb, does not require you to accept any theological conclusion. It is possible to be a thorough skeptic about the resurrection and still acknowledge, as historian E.P. Sanders did, that Jesus of Nazareth was a real person who was crucified under Pontius Pilate, that his followers believed they had seen him alive afterward, and that the movement that grew out of that belief changed the world more completely than any other event in the history of human civilization. That is simply the historical record. What you make of it is your business. The Roman Empire was the greatest military power the ancient world had ever seen. It had conquered Britain and North Africa and Mesopotamia and Spain. It had destroyed Jerusalem and dispersed the Jewish people. It had crucified tens of thousands of men. And of all those men, Of every rebel and revolutionary and philosopher and pretender to power who died on a Roman cross, only one of them is still remembered. Only one of them is still worshipped. Only one of them has had every calendar on earth count time from his birth. Only one of them changed every civilization his story touched. Whether you believe that he rose from the dead or not, that is a fact. And facts have a way of demanding that we take them seriously, even when we cannot fully explain them. The question that Jerusalem asked in the spring of 30 A.D., standing before a man from Nazareth, "What shall I do with this Jesus?" is the same question that history has been asking ever since. Every person who has ever heard this story has had to answer it, including you. I want to ask you something before you click away. We talked today about a man who, with his final breaths, looked at the people killing him and asked God to forgive them. We talked about a tomb that was empty when every power in the ancient world wanted it to remain occupied. We talked about a movement that should have died with its founder and instead changed the world. So here's my question for the comments. What is the detail from this story? The specific moment, the specific piece of evidence, the specific historical fact that you find hardest to explain? The empty tomb? The transformation of the disciples? The response of Pilate? The medical record? What is the one thing that, when you really sit with it, gives you pause? Write it in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to have that conversation with you. And before we close, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We have viewers on this channel from all over the world, and this particular story belongs to all of us, regardless of where we come from or what we believe. Drop your location in the comments. We would love to hear from you, and if this documentary gave you something to think about, if it challenged something you thought you knew, or confirmed something you always believed, or simply sent you down a research path you want to follow, please hit the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We have more of these coming. Deep, detailed, historically grounded examinations of the stories that shaped the world. You will not want to miss them. The Crucifixion of Jesus Christ. It happened in Jerusalem. In the spring of 30 A.D., to a man who had spent 3 years telling the world that God's love was stronger than anything the world could throw against it. Rome threw everything it had. And 2,000 years later, we are still talking about it. We are still asking the question. We are still standing, ikaz, in one way or another, at the foot of that cross, looking up. That is the power of this story. That is why it will never go away. Thank you for watching. God bless you, and we will see you in the next one.